At first, it doesn't feel like a victory at all. In fact, most people don't even notice it when it happens. You just wake up one day and realize something is different. The texts don't spike your heart rate anymore. The tone in their voice doesn't send you into panic or self-doubt. The familiar knot in your stomach doesn't show up on cue. And that's when the real shift has already taken place. Because the narcissist's greatest leverage over you was never the words they said, it was the emotional reaction they could pull out of you on demand. For a long time, your nervous system was trained to respond. Every criticism felt like an emergency. Every silence felt like abandonment. Every unpredictable mood shift kept you scanning, adjusting, over-explaining. You weren't weak. You were conditioned. When someone uses intermittent validation, fear, and confusion, your body learns to stay on high alert. That constant reaction was the fuel. That reaction was the supply. And then slowly, quietly, something changes. You still notice their behavior, but it no longer takes over your body. You don't rush to defend yourself. You don't replay conversations all night trying to prove your point. You don't feel that desperate urge to fix the tension or restore the peace at your own expense. You can hear a jab and think, "That's interesting," instead of "What did I do wrong?" That's not indifference. That's regulation. This is where people get confused because we're taught that winning looks loud. It looks confrontational. It looks like finally saying the perfect sentence that shuts them down. But narcissistic dynamics don't end through dramatic moments. They end when the emotional charge disappears, when there's no spike, no collapse, no chase, no visible distress. That's when the dynamic starts to die. A narcissist depends on your emotional engagement. Anger works, tears work, over-explaining works, even silence when it's filled with hurt and longing works. What doesn't work is calm. What doesn't work is neutrality. What doesn't work is someone who no longer hands over their emotional state to be managed, manipulated, or mined. And here's the part that matters. You didn't do this by becoming cold or cruel. You did it by healing. You did it by learning to pause instead of react. By reminding yourself that not every comment requires a response, that not every accusation deserves a defense, that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. You started choosing peace over being right, and that choice quietly dismantled their influence. You may still feel emotions because you're human, but they move through you instead of hijacking you. You can feel irritation without spiraling, sadness without collapsing, disappointment without self-blame. That's emotional maturity, not detachment, and it signals something important. You're no longer emotionally organized around them. When this happens, narcissists often escalate. They may provoke more, accuse more, or suddenly try to re-engage. That's because they feel the shift before you do. They sense the loss of access. The emotional doors that once swung open so easily are now closed, and they don't know the code anymore. And while they may push harder, it lands softer because the hooks are gone. The most powerful part of this change is how ordinary it feels. There's no victory lap, no announcement, just a quieter mind, a steadier body, a growing sense that you don't need to participate in chaos to prove your worth. You stop measuring your well-being based on how they're acting and start measuring it by how you feel inside your own skin. That's the moment you've already won. Because when they can no longer control your emotional weather, they've lost the only power they ever truly had. Another sign that you've already won often shows up in a way that surprises people. You stop feeling confused. Not because the behavior stopped, but because it started to make sense. The things that once felt disorienting, personal, or even crazy-making now feel strangely familiar. The patterns repeat so clearly that you can almost predict what comes next. And when manipulation becomes predictable, it loses its power. There was a time when every interaction felt like walking into fog. You'd leave conversations, replaying them over and over, wondering what just happened. How did a simple question turn into an argument? How did their hurtful comment become your fault? How did you end up apologizing when you were the one who was hurt? That mental whiplash wasn't accidental. Confusion is a tool. When someone keeps you off balance, you stay focused on figuring them out instead of trusting yourself. But something shifts when clarity arrives. You start noticing the sequence. First comes the charm, then the subtle dig, then the denial, then the blame shift, then the sudden victimhood. It's not random anymore. It's a script. And once you see the script, you stop auditioning for the role they want you to play. You don't argue every distortion. You don't chase every contradiction. You don't try to win conversations that were never designed to be fair. This is where people often feel a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness because you realize how long you were caught in something that was never about mutual understanding. Relief because you finally understand that the confusion wasn't a failure of intelligence or strength. It was the result of sustained psychological manipulation. You weren't missing something. They were moving the goalposts. When the tactics become predictable, your emotional response changes. You stop bracing yourself for impact. You stop scanning for the next explosion. You stop thinking, if I just say it the right way, this will go differently. Because you now know it won't. Not because you're pessimistic, but because you're realistic. Patterns tell the truth when words don't. And here's the part that truly marks the shift. You no longer feel the need to explain what's happening to them. You may still explain it to yourself or to safe people, but not to the person who benefits from not understanding. You stop handing them a roadmap to your boundaries. You stop giving detailed feedback to someone who uses it as ammunition. That silence isn't avoidance, it's wisdom. Predictability also gives you back your time. You're no longer mentally rehearsing conversations that haven't happened yet. You're no longer deconstructing every text message like it's a code that needs to be cracked. Your energy starts flowing back into your own life, your own thoughts, your own growth. And that shift is deeply threatening to someone who relied on occupying your mental space. This is often when narcissists accuse you of being distant, cold, or changed. And they're not wrong. You have changed. You've stopped participating in the illusion. You've stopped believing that chaos equals connection. You've stopped mistaking intensity for intimacy, and because they can't pull you into the old dance anymore, they feel the loss of control. It's important to understand that predictability doesn't mean harmlessness. The behavior may still be hurtful. The words may still sting. But now, instead of internalizing it, you contextualize it. You recognize it as part of a pattern rather than a verdict on your worth. That distinction is everything. When manipulati on becomes boring, when gaslighting sounds repetitive instead of convincing, when blame feels automatic instead of believable, you're already out. Not physically, maybe not even visibly, but psychologically. And once you leave psychologically, the dynamic can never fully recover. Because the moment you stop being confused is the moment you stop being controllable. One of the quietest but most profound shifts happens when you stop needing anything from them. No explanation, no apology, no moment of insight where they finally look at you and say, "Now I understand what I did to you." For a long time, that moment may have felt essential. You told yourself that if they could just get it, if they could just see the damage, then maybe you could finally move on. But that hope kept you tethered far longer than you realized. Seeking closure from a narcissistic person feels logical. After all, you invested emotionally. You tried to communicate, you showed empathy, so it makes sense to want some acknowledgement of the harm. The problem is that accountability threatens their entire psychological structure. Admitting wrongdoing would require self-reflection, vulnerability, and responsibility, things they are deeply defended against. So instead of closure, you got denial, or minimization, or blame, or a version of events where you were somehow the problem. And for a while, you kept trying. You explained your feelings in different ways. You softened your tone. You brought evidence. You aided for the right moment. You believed that clarity would come if you were just patient enough or articulate enough. But every attempt left you more exhausted, more doubting, more entangled. Not because you were doing it wrong, but because you were asking the wrong person to validate your reality. The shift comes when you finally stop asking, not in anger, not in bitterness, but in acceptance. You accept that they may never admit what they did. They may never apologize in a way that feels real. They may never show insight or remorse. And instead of that realization breaking you, it frees you. Because now you no longer measure your healing by their behavior. This is often misunderstood as giving up. It's not. It's letting go of a fantasy that kept you stuck. You're not excusing the harm. You're not minimizing the impact. You're simply no longer waiting for permission to move on. You stop rehearsing what you'd say if you ever got the chance to confront them again. You stop imagining how vindicating it would feel if they finally took responsibility. You stop organizing your story around their response, and something remarkable happens in that space. You start trusting your own narrative. You don't need them to confirm what you lived through. You know what happened. Your body knows. Your emotional memory knows. The clarity you gained doesn't disappear just because they refuse to acknowledge it. You stop outsourcing your sense of reality to someone who distorted it in the first place. This is also where a deeper calm settles in. Without the constant pull of unfinished emotional business, your mind quiets. You're not scanning for signs of regret. You're not hoping for a message that finally makes it all make sense. You're not waiting for closure to arrive wrapped in an apology. Closure becomes something internal, something you create by choosing yourself again and again. Narcissistic people often rely on your need for validation to keep a door open. As long as you're waiting for acknowledgement, there's still a connection. But when you stop seeking it, the door closes. Not dramatically, not with a slam, but with a quiet finality. And that's when the power dynamic truly shifts. You may notice that their words no longer carry the same weight. Praise doesn't inflate you. Criticism doesn't define you. Because your self-worth is no longer being negotiated in conversations that were never safe. You've removed yourself from the courtroom where you were always on trial. This doesn't mean you feel nothing. It means you feel grounded. You feel anchored in your own understanding, and that is incredibly threatening to someone who once controlled the narrative. When you stop looking to them for closure, you stop looking back. And that's when you realize you didn't lose anything by letting go, you gained yourself. At some point, often without trying or even noticing at first, your life starts to move forward. Not in a dramatic, headline-worthy way, but in small, steady shifts that add up. You find yourself laughing more easily, making plans without anxiety, feeling moments of peace that don't come with a catch. And then, almost accidentally, you notice something else while you're growing, changing, expanding. They seem stuck. This isn't about comparison, even though it can feel that way at first. It's not about winning a race or proving that you're doing better. In fact, many people feel uncomfortable even acknowledging this shift because they don't want to sound arrogant or vindictive. But this isn't ego. It's psychology. Healing creates movement. Narcissistic patterns create repetition. When you were entangled with them, so much of your energy went into managing the relationship, reading moods, preventing explosions, repairing damage you didn't cause. That constant emotional labor left very little space for growth. Once that burden lifts, even partially, your energy has somewhere else to go. You invest in yourself, your interests, your friendships, your health, your work. Your inner world starts to feel larger again. Meanwhile, narcissistic individuals tend to cycle through the same dynamics. New people, same problems. Different setting, same conflicts. The story doesn't evolve because self-reflection isn't part of the process. Without accountability or insight, growth stalls. So while you're learning, adapting, and healing, they're often reenacting familiar patterns, convinced the issue is always external. This defer. NCE can feel unsettling at first. You may catch yourself wondering if you're being unfair or judgmental. You might even feel guilt for moving on when they seem unchanged. That guilt is a leftover from a time when you were trained to prioritize their emotional state over your own. But growth isn't cruelty. It's what happens when survival mode ends. What's especially telling is that your expansion isn't loud. You're not posting to prove anything. You're not trying to show them what they lost. In many cases, you don't even want them to notice. You're simply living. And that quiet forward motion is exactly what they struggle to tolerate. As you grow, your standards change. Your tolerance for chaos drops. Your capacity for joy increases. You start choosing relationships that feel reciprocal instead of draining. You're not chasing intensity anymore. You're choosing stability. And from the outside, that can look boring to someone who thrives on drama. But from the inside, it feels like freedom. Narcissistic people often experience other people's growth as abandonment or betrayal. Your healing highlights what they refuse to face. Your peace exposes their unrest. And while you're not responsible for how they respond to that, you may notice them minimizing your progress, dismissing your achievements, or suddenly trying to reinsert themselves into your life. Not because they've changed, but because your movement reminds them of their stagnation. It's important to remember that this is a moral judgment. You're not better than them. You're just doing different work. You chose to look inward. You chose discomfort in the service of healing. You chose to break a cycle rather than repeat it. That choice has consequences, and one of them is growth. Over time, the contrast becomes clearer. You feel more like yourself than you have in years. You make decisions from clarity rather than fear. Your life feels aligned instead of reactive. And their world, from what you can see, still revolves around the same conflicts, the same grievances, the same unmet expectations. You didn't defeat them by outperforming them. You did it by outgrowing the dynamic entirely. This is often the moment that surprises people the most. Just when you feel steadier, clearer, and less emotionally invested, they suddenly reappear in some form. A message out of nowhere, a sudden kindness, a crisis they need you for, or even a subtle reminder of the past meant to stir nostalgia. And what's striking isn't that they try to re-engage, it's how different it feels when they do. There was a time when this kind of attention would have pulled you right back in. Your heart would race. Your mind would start negotiating. You'd wonder if maybe this time would be different. Maybe they've changed. Maybe they finally see your value. That pull was powerful because it tapped into hope, empathy, and unfinished emotional business. But now, something else happens. You feel it, but it doesn't take you over. The message lands, and instead of excitement or dread, there's a pause. You notice the timing. You notice the tone. You notice the pattern. And rather than feeling flattered or afraid, you feel clarity. The urgency you once felt to respond, to explain, to rescue simply isn't there anymore. That's because these attempts aren't about connection, they're about control. When narcissistic individuals sense that they're losing emotional access to you, they often escalate their efforts, not with accountability or genuine change, but with tactics designed to pull you back into the familiar dynamic. The goal isn't intimacy, it's reassurance that they still matter, that they still have influence, that the door isn't fully closed. What's different now is that you can feel the desperation underneath it. You recognize the hooks, the sudden vulnerability that appears without any real reflection, the nostalgia that ignores the harm, the "I miss you" that doesn't come with responsibility. You don't need to analyze it deeply because you've seen it before. And instead of feeling chosen, you feel cautious. Instead of feeling tempted, you feel grounded. This doesn't mean you feel superior. It means you're no longer hungry for crumbs. You're no longer mistaking attention for care. You understand that real change is consistent, not urgent, quiet, not dramatic. And because what's being offered now doesn't align with that, it simply doesn't have the same pull. Many people feel guilty at this stage. They worry they're being cold or unforgiving. But there's a difference between compassion and self-betrayal. You can understand why someone is reaching out without reopening a door that cost you your peace. Boundaries don't require anger, they require clarity. What's especially telling is how your body responds. There's no adrenaline surge, no knot in your stomach, no compulsion to fix things. Your nervous system recognizes that this isn't safe or new, it's familiar. And familiarity, once you've healed, isn't comforting anymore. It's information. At this point, their attempts may even feel hollow. The words don't land the way they used to. The gestures feel performative. And instead of wondering what it means, you ask a different question: what does this cost me if I engage? That question alone signals how far you've come. You may choose not to respond at all, or you may respond briefly, neutrally, without opening emotional space. Either way, the power shift is clear. You're no longer reacting, you're choosing. And choice is the one thing narcissistic dynamics can't survive. The irony is that they often interpret your calm as cruelty. They may accuse you of being heartless or changed, but what they're really reacting to is the loss of leverage. You're no longer accessible in the way you once were. And that loss can feel unbearable to someone who relied on your emotional availability to regulate themselves. The moment their attempts feel desperate instead of dangerous, tempting, or flattering, that's the moment you realize you're no longer in the dynamic. You've stepped outside it. And once you see it from the outside, you can never fully go back. Because when someone can no longer pull you toward them, they've already lost you. And that's the quietest kind of freedom. By the time you reach this point, something fundamental has returned to you, your trust in yourself. Not the loud, performative kind of confidence, but a steady, grounded knowing. For a long time, that trust was slowly eroded. You were second-guessing your perceptions, questioning your reactions, wondering if you were too sensitive, too demanding, or simply wrong. And when that happens enough times, you stop using your own inner compass. That loss of self-trust is one of the deepest injuries in a narcissistic dynamic. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments, when your memory is challenged, when your feelings are minimized, and your intuition tells you something is off, but you're persuaded to ignore it. Over time, you learn to look outward for confirmation instead of inward for truth. What changes now is subtle but profound. You start listening to yourself again. When something feels uncomfortable, you don't talk yourself out of it. When a boundary feels necessary, you don't justify it endlessly. When a situation feels unsafe or draining, you give yourself permission to step back without a full courtroom presentation of reasons. That internal shift doesn't make you rigid. It makes you aligned. This is often the point where people realize the narcissist's greatest aim was never love or even admiration. It was influence, control over how you see yourself, how you interpret reality, how you decide what's acceptable. And when you reclaim your self-trust, that control evaporates. You're no longer asking, "Is this okay?" You're asking, "Is this right for me?" That question alone changes everything. With self-trust comes boundaries that feel natural rather than forced. You're not setting them to punish anyone. You're setting them because they make sense. You stop explaining why you need space. You stop defending why something doesn't work for you. You understand that healthy people don't require constant justification, and unhealthy ones will never be satisfied by it anyway. You may also notice a shift in how you speak to yourself. The harsh inner critic quiets. The self-blame softens. Instead of assuming fault, you get curious. Instead of shaming yourself for staying too long or missing red flags, you offer yourself compassion. You recognize that survival required adaptation, and healing requires honesty, not punishment. This is deeply destabilizing to narcissistic dynamics because once you trust yourself, you don't need to be managed. You don't need constant reassurance. You don't need approval to make decisions. You don't need someone else to define your worth. And without that dependency, there's nothing left to manipulate. What's powerful is that this trust doesn't make you reckless. It actually makes you calmer. You're less reactive because you know you'll take care of yourself if something goes wrong. You're less afraid of making mistakes because you trust your ability to course correct. That sense of internal safety replaces the chaos that once felt familiar. At this stage, even if the narcissist is still physically present in your life, through work, family, or shared history, the dynamic has changed. You're no longer organizing your behavior around their moods. You're no longer shrinking to keep the peace. You're no longer abandoning yourself to maintain connection. And that is the ultimate defeat of a narcissistic pattern. Because narcissism cannot survive where self-trust lives. You don't need to prove anything. You don't need to confront or convince. Your life becomes the evidence, not in achievements, but in peace, not in dominance, but in alignment. And the most powerful part is that this victory doesn't look like a win from the outside. It looks like a person who finally believes themselves, and that is something no narcissist can ever take away again.